as we're hearing tonight, corporations, governments around the world are launching massive attacks on working people and the poor. They're telling us that we're all in it together. And what their measures are necessary. These measures are necessary, they're telling us, to keep governments from going bankrupt and to keep corporations competitive. But it's not simply a question of cost trimming, cutting deficits, or bringing budgets into line. They want to use this opportunity to fundamentally change the nature of society and the role of the state. The question that's being posed is why the working class and the poor should pay the cost when we did nothing to cause the crisis, as Andrea said. Why not clamp down on businesses that have been breaking the law, using financial loopholes, continuing to make profits, and giving massive bonuses to upper management? Why not nationalize the banks and corporations and bring profits into the public realm? The answer is that the attacks are not a pragmatic response to an economic crisis, but the implementation of an economic ideology intended to serve the wealthy that is bringing increased suffering and dislocation to working people and the poor around the world. The ruling classes are also gambling that the anger from below can be contained. We know that there is opposition to the attacks in this country, but the resistance is not automatic. Workers and the poor remain caught, and we see this in a lot of workplaces, between fear and anger, wanting to fight but feeling a pessimism that maybe we can't win. And if you look around us, in our communities, in our neighborhoods, the changes in the lives of ordinary Canadians over the last 30 years have swept away old certainties. This is a process that's been accelerated by the economic crisis and the austerity agenda. Fear of the precariousness and the instability of our lives. Immigrants who come to Canada with hopes of a better life face systemic racism and a growing gap between rich and poor. 100,000 manufacturing jobs have been lost in the Greater Toronto Area in the last few years. Prosperity for those who worked hard, the foundation of the so-called American or Canadian dream, is in tatters as governments rescue the rich. The polarization of social conditions and politics is likely to continue as more and more are alienated from the political system. Now, the austerity agenda, as we're hearing, is being implemented worldwide, and the local manifestation, as Andrew was talking about, is equally as harsh in its attack on public services, on unions. And anyone who read Naomi Klein's shock doctrine will recognize the approach. In response to any crisis, the champions of neoliberalism have a ready-made response. Shrink public programs and governments by cutting or privatizing public services, sell public assets, weaken public ability to regulate corporations, and of course attack workers. Shift the cost of the crisis off the corporations, as we've seen with McGuinty and Harper, and the wealthy, to working people and the poor by cutting the corporate taxes, increasing user fees, withdrawing from key areas of responsibility so people will have to buy services from private corporations. And of course, reducing workers' wages by gutting labor laws, weakening unions, contracting out our jobs, increasing precarious work, and reducing employment standards. In contrast, the treatment of working people who are losing their jobs, their homes, their unions, to the treatment of those who are responsible for the financial meltdown. The Harper agenda encompasses the approach, taking away the right to strike from Air Canada and postal workers, massive downsizing of the federal government, slashing employment insurance, as we heard, huge cutbacks. Ford in Toronto contracting out garbage collection, cleaners. Dalton McGuinty laying off provincial public sector workers and cutting services. The attacks are coming hard and fast. And the issue is whether the working class can stop what is happening, whether we can build the resistance necessary. The neoliberals, they're testing the waters, seeing how far they can go. And they have had wins. The electromotive lockout in London, QP 79 and 416. David, I see you're there, but it wasn't what you call a victory. And the ruling class has really gambled that the mass of populations will accept the attacks, and we're seeing that that's not always the case. If we look at Greece, what Nikos was saying, in Spain, in China, in France, India, England, Britain, workers, students, and the marginally employed have risen up and fought back. And we're going to hear about the magnificent student strike in Quebec. And they are not backing down, and it's just an extraordinary. Now, who is going to win and who will lose is obviously still an open question. But we know that working people have the potential to push back these attacks, but only if we're organized to do so. And we've seen very tough fights here in Canada. In our own union, the steelworkers, the Valley Inco miners were out for a whole year, walking the line to save a defined pension plan for new hires, not only themselves. Eventually, they bit the bullet and they settled. Steelworkers Local 1005, one of them was here last year on our panel, fought a very hard battle when they were locked out by U.S. Steel, refusing to give up the same. They again fought for almost a year before the membership felt they had no choice but to go back. But the library workers, as Andrea was saying, they held a 2.5-week strike and were able to hold the line against the worst of the concessions that were being forced upon them. Because they built a creative fight back, meetings before the strike in every workplace, building public support, winning the public relations war, and they were able to hold their heads high and walk back with what they felt was a victory. We saw the Wildcat by machinists. We've got a machinist in the room. Jeff, I just saw you walk in from the airport. The Wildcat by the machinists in British Columbia, Toronto, Quebec, in response to fellow workers at Pearson Airport being suspended for slow clapping and taunting the Minister of Labour as she walked through the terminal in Toronto. You know, so annoying. Now, she had taken their right to strike. That's pretty annoying, too. But so what they did is illegally shut down the airline for a day. The company lost millions in that day, and workers around the country cheered them, and it gives a glimpse of what is possible when workers gain the confidence to fight. Thousands mobilized, as Andrew was saying, and fought back in the city of Toronto. Didn't win everything, but saved many of the service and jobs against the neoliberal acts of Mayor Ford. 1,000 cleaners organized within the community, in the Tamil community, the Spanish community, the Portuguese community, leafleting door to door. They were able to save their jobs. And I have to mention, and it's maybe steelworker sectionalism, I don't know, but there's a critical strike in Alma, Quebec. Almost 800 steelworkers have been locked out by Rio Tinto, a nasty, nasty multinational. Now, the company demanded that all new hires and a section of the current workforce, some of the trades, become contract workers at half the wages, half the rate of pay. They refused to accept it, were thrown out of their jobs on New Year's Eve. And when they felt they were not being given the support of their union, they demanded that, and put heavy pressure on the leadership. And their rank and file solidarity and the pressure made the union respond in a way that we're seeing today. Now, that group of workers in the Saguenay and 3 hours essentially north of Quebec City, they've organized their entire community. The hockey rink sports the Metallo banner hanging from the rafters, along with 2 scarves from Toronto. English-French solidarity in the working class. And Toronto workers travel by bus, and many of you guys are here, you did it, 13 hours to involve themselves in solidarity twice for those workers. They went to Montreal, participated in the student strike. They went to Montreal by bus themselves to participate in the 250,000 strong Earth Day march, and they're fighting hard. And talk about solidarity. Rio Tinto workers in Kitimat, BC are giving $65,000 a week out of their own pay packets to those workers in Alma. It's extraordinary. I've never seen this happen. And we're in the process, Michelle and John and others who are here, organizing benefit rallies in Toronto, in Hamilton, Sudbury in July. And now we've got 4,800 rail workers who just walked off the job in this country. So things are happening, things are percolating. And it's why it's so important when campaigns of this nature break out that we have to build the solidarity, as much solidarity as possible, because any victory could reverberate in workplaces across the country. Now, in spite of all these local fightbacks, we know there's been no broad mobilization beyond the Quebec student strike, no broad worker mobilization as we've seen in other countries. The rank and file organization is still weak, but it's building, and it still could come. And the return of mass strikes globally, the indignados in Spain, the Occupy movement, the massive and ongoing student strike in Quebec creates the potential for greater resistance. And today we are seeing that the economic crisis continues to feed into a political crisis that is having serious ramifications around the world. And we've got to remember there are times, decades even, when nothing seems to happen. And then suddenly history seems to leap forward, as we saw in the Arab Spring. And remember the Wisconsin uprising last year put working class protest firmly on the agenda in a way not seen in North America in decades. Its creativity, its spontaneity, its organizing power, you know, whether you judge it won or lost. And this was taken even further in the Occupy movement, which in turn reinvigorated unions that had involved themselves with them and encouraged practical grassroots democracy. Their message, we are the 99%, turned attention on those responsible for the crisis, on those who should be made to pay. It brought the language of class into the mainstream and had resonance for millions in the US and Canada who were bearing the brunts of the attacks. So the combination of the increasingly intractable economic crisis and the return of mass strikes, both worker and student, means the stakes are very high. The students in Quebec rejecting the tentative settlement showed the way forward for workers in Quebec and Canada, because what they combined was a growing class bitterness, I believe, and a willingness to take action. And as some of their leaders have said, they were hoping and are hoping still to spark a broader fight back against the austerity agenda. Now we know that struggle doesn't develop at the same rate. While capitalism is global, its effects are conditioned by the nation state and local conditions, but movements that have success in one area can inspire actions in another. The Occupy movement brought a renewed debate about the inability of the system to meet the basic needs of millions of people, even in the most developed countries. And this is not lost on workers who are underemployed or are fearful for their jobs and are seeing attacks all around them. And what is key is building rank and file strength, building unity among workers, and not allowing the tactics of divide and rule to prevail and weaken resistance. We have seen the politics of envy ramped up by governments and corporations, pitting one against the other in the race to the bottom. And one thing that we have learned from what has been happening in the fight against austerity in Europe and around the world, is that this is a process and not an event. I say it all the time. The crisis is itself protracted, and the level of fight back has to be seen on a long-term scale. And it's time like these, when the system that we live under is showing itself in all its horror, that working people begin to look at alternatives to the market, alternatives to a system based on exploitation and oppression, pitting one against another for the sake of more and more profits. We must be in the thick of the battles, rooting ourselves in our workplaces, our campuses, linking with the community, as Andrea was saying, and bringing forward alternatives which can point the way forward to a society which will stop the ruthless exploitation that we are seeing all around us. We have a world to win. Thank you.